Listen to a conversation between a student and a professor.
Sandy, how's class been going for you this semester?
Oh, it's great. I really like your business psychology class, but I have one major concern about the last assignment. You know, the one where we have to interview a local business owner, entrepreneur.
Are you having trouble coming up with interview questions?
Well, that's just it. I worked on my high school newspaper for years, so I actually have great questions to ask. The thing is, I'm new to the area, and I don't know people off campus. So I was wondering could you possibly give me the name of someone I could interview?
You don't know anyone who owns a business?
Well, yeah, back home. My next-door neighbors. They own a shoe store, and they're really successful, but they're not local.
Well, it wouldn't be fair to the other students if I gave you the name of a contact, but I could help you figure out a way to find someone on your own. Let's see. Do you read the local newspaper?
Sure, whenever I have the time.
Well, the business section in the paper often has stories about local business people who've been successful. If you find an article, you could call the person who's profiled.
You mean just call them up out of the blue and ask them if they'll talk to me?
Sure, why not?
Well, aren't people like that awfully busy? Too busy to talk to a random college student?
Many people enjoy telling the story of how they got started. Remember, this is a business psychology class, and for this assignment, I want you to get some real insight about business owners, their personality, what drives them to become an entrepreneur.
Like how they think.
And what motivates them. Why did they start their business? I'm sure they'd talk to you, especially if you tell them you might start a business someday.
I'm not sure I'd have the guts to do that. Opening a business seems so risky, so scary.
Well, you can ask them if they felt that way too. Now you just need to find someone to interview to see if your instincts are correct.
Listen again to part of the conversation, then answer the question.
Are you having trouble coming up with interview questions?
Well, that's just it. I worked on my high school newspaper for years, so I actually have great questions to ask.
What does the student imply? Listen to part of a lecture in an anthropology class.
Okay, I want to begin today by talking about calendars. I know some of you are thinking it's not all that fascinating, right? But listen, the next time you look at a calendar, I want you to keep something in mind. There are at least 3 natural ways of measuring the passage of time: by day, by month, and by year. And these are all pretty easy to see, right? A day is based on 1 rotation of Earth. A month is how long the moon takes to move around the Earth, and a year is the time it takes for Earth to move around the sun, right? So they're all based on natural events. But the natural clocks of Earth, the moon, and the sun run on different times. And you can't divide any one of these time periods by another one without having some messy fraction left over. I mean, 1 lunar month, that's the time it takes for the moon to go around Earth. 1 month is about 29.5 days. Not really a nice round number. And 1 year is a little more than 365 days. So these are obviously numbers that don't divide into each other very neatly. And this makes it pretty difficult to create some sort of tidy calendar that really works. Not that different cultures haven't tried. Have any of you ever been to Stonehenge? No? You know that amazing circle of giant stones in England? Well, if you ever go and find yourself wondering why this culture, way back in prehistoric England, would go to so much work to construct this monumental ring of enormous stones, well, keep in mind that a lot of us think it was designed, at least partially, as a calendar, to mark when the seasons of the year begin, according to the exact day when the sun comes up from a particular direction. I have colleagues who insist it's a temple, maybe, or a tomb, but they can't deny that it was also used as a calendar, probably to help figure out, for example, when farmers should begin their planting each year. The Mayans in Central America also invented a calendar, but for a different purpose. The Mayans, especially the royalty and priests, wanted to look at long cycles of history. So the calendar they used had to be able to count far into the future as well as far into the past. And not only were the Mayans keeping track of the natural timekeepers we mentioned before, Earth, the moon, and the sun, but another natural timekeeper, the planet Venus. Venus rises in the sky as the morning star every 584 days. And the Venus cycle was incorporated in the Mayan calendar. So the Mayans kept track of long periods of time, and they did it so accurately, in fact, that their calendar is considered about as complicated and sophisticated as any in the world. Now, the ancient Chinese believed very strongly in astrology, the idea that you can predict future events based on the positions of the stars and planets, like, say, Jupiter. Incidentally, the whole Chinese system of astrology was based on the fact that the planet Jupiter goes around the sun once every 12 years. So 1 orbit of Jupiter lasts 12 of our Earth years. Apparently, that's why the Chinese calendar has a cycle of 12 years. You know, like the year of the dragon, the year of the tiger, and so on. All parts of a 12-year astrological cycle that we get from the orbit of Jupiter. Calendars based on the orbits of other planets, though, are a lot less common than those based on the cycle of the moon, the lunar month. I could mention any number of important cultures around the world that have depended on lunar calendars, but there really isn't time. So let's go right to the calendar that's now used throughout most of the world, a solar calendar, based on the number of days in a year. This calendar is mainly derived from the one the ancient Romans devised a couple thousand years ago. I mean, the Romans, with more than a little help from the Greeks, realized that a year actually lasts about 365 1/4 days. And so they decided to round off most years to 365 days, but make every 4th year into a leap year. I mean, somehow you have to account for that extra 1/4 of a day each year. So every 4 years, they made the calendar 1 day longer. By adding the leap year, the Romans were able to make a calendar that worked so well that with a few minor adjustments, this calendar is still widely
Listen to part of a lecture in an astronomy class.
I'm sure you all have been following the news about Mars. A lot of spacecraft have been visiting the planet recently. Some have gone into orbit around it, while others have landed on it. And they've sent back an abundance of data that's reshaping our knowledge, our vision of the planet in a lot of ways. Is there anything that you've been particularly struck by in all the news reports?
Well, they seem to mention water a lot, which kind of surprised me, as I have this picture in my head that Mars is dry, sort of dry and dead.
You're not the only one. You know, for centuries, most of our knowledge of the planet came from what we saw through telescopes. So, obviously, it was pretty limited. And our views of the planet were formed as much by writers as they were by serious scientists. When the first science fiction stories came out, Mars was described as being a lot like Earth, except...
I know the planet was red and the people were green. I've seen some of those old movies. What were they thinking? I mean, really,
Well, it seems silly to us now, but those ideas were quite imaginative and occasionally scary in their time. Anyway, we began to rethink our image of Mars when the first spacecraft flew by the planet in 1965 and sent pictures back to Earth. Those pictures showed a planet that looked a lot more like our moon than Earth. Lots of craters and not much else. It was bitterly cold. It had a very thin atmosphere, and that atmosphere was mostly carbon dioxide. So the view of Mars after this first flyby mission was that dry, dead planet that Lisa mentioned. But then there were more visits to the planet in the 1970s. And this time the spacecraft didn't just fly by, they orbited, or landed. This allowed us to receive much more detailed images of the planet, and it turned out to be a pretty interesting place. Mars has a lot more than craters. It has giant volcanoes and deep canyons. It also showed signs of dried-up riverbeds and plains that had been formed by massive floods. So we concluded that there must have been water on the planet at one time, billions of years ago. Now, what does it take for water to exist?
You need to have a warm enough temperature so that it doesn't freeze.
That's one thing. And the other is that you need enough atmospheric pressure, thick enough air so that the water doesn't instantly vaporize. The Mars we see today doesn't have either of those conditions. It's too cold and the air is too thin. But a long time ago, there may have been a thicker atmosphere that created a greenhouse effect that raised temperatures. And maybe that combination produced water on the surface of the planet. So maybe Mars wasn't just a dead, boring rock. Maybe it was a fascinating fossil that was once alive and dynamic, worthy of exploration. Now, let's jump forward a few decades to the beginning of this century and a new generation of orbiters and landers that have been sent to Mars. Of course, the scientific instruments now surveying Mars are far more sophisticated than the instruments of the 70s, so we're getting all kinds of new data for analysis. And not surprisingly, that data is challenging our notions of what Mars is like. Lisa, you mentioned that a lot of the news reports talked about water. Do you remember any of the details?
Well, they were showing these pictures of these long cuts in the ground, which would be gullies on Earth. They say that since gullies are usually formed by water, it seems like they may be evidence that water still exists on Mars, but I didn't get how that worked.
I'm not surprised. There are a lot of theories, a lot of speculation, and some argue the formations aren't caused by water at all. But there's some ingenious theories that assume that there's a lot of water right under the planet's surface that somehow is causing the gullies to form. If we could only get a lander there. But the gullies aren't in places where we can send landers yet. Anyway, if there is some kind of water activity, it may change our view of the planet once again to something that's not dead, not even a fossil, but rather a planet like Earth that undergoes cycles. Think of our ice ages over long periods of time. Maybe Mars could sustain water again. That's
Why does the professor say this?
So maybe Mars wasn't just a dead, boring rock. Maybe it was a fascinating fossil that was once alive and dynamic, worthy of exploration.
Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question.
I know the planet was red and the people were green. I've seen some of those old movies. What were they thinking? I mean, really.
Why does the student say this?
What were they thinking?
Listen to part of a conversation between a student and a university employee.
Oh, hello. Can I help you?
Yeah. I'm looking for Professor Kirk. Is she here? Is this her office?
Yes, you're in the right place. Professor Kirk's office is right behind me. But no, she's not here right now.
Do you know when she'll be back?
Well, she's teaching all morning. She won't be back until, let me check. She won't be back until after lunch. That's when she has her office hours. Perhaps you could come back then?
Oh, unfortunately, no. I have class this afternoon, and I was really hoping to talk to her today. Hey, do you know if she's accepting any more students into her Introduction to Biology class?
You want to know if you can take the class?
Yes, if she's letting any more students sign up, I'd like to join the class.
Introduction to Biology is a very popular class, especially when she teaches it. A lot of students take it.
Yeah, that's why the registrar said it was full. I've got the form the registrar gave me, to get her permission to take the class. It's all filled out except for her signature. I'm hoping she'll let me in even though the class is full. You see, I'm a senior this year, and this will be my last semester, so it's my last chance.
Oh, wow, really? I mean, most students fulfill their science requirement the first year.
Well, to be honest, I kept putting it off. I'm not really a big fan of science classes in general, and with the labs and everything, I've never quite found the time.
Your advisor didn't say anything?
Well, to tell you the truth, she's been after me to take a class like this for a while, but I'm double majoring in art and journalism, and so my schedule's been really tight with all the classes I gotta take, so somehow I never...
Well, perhaps you could leave the form with me, and I'll see if she'll sign it for you.
I appreciate that, but maybe I should explain the problem to her in person. I didn't want to do it, but I guess I'll have to send her an email.
Not all professors check their emails regularly. I'm not sure if Professor Kirk does it or not. Here's an idea. Why don't you stick a note explaining your situation under her door and ask her to call you if she needs more information?
Hey, that's a good idea. And then I can leave the form with you, if you still don't mind.
Why does the man say this to the woman?
I appreciate that, but maybe I should explain the problem to her in person.
Listen to part of a lecture in a biology class.
Well, it's finally looking like spring is arriving. The last of the winter snow will be melting away in a few days. So before we close today, I thought I'd mention a biological event that's part of the transition from winter to spring. Something you can go outside and watch if you have some patience. There's a small creature that lives in this area. You've probably seen it. It's the North American wood frog. Now, the wood frog's not that easy to spot since it stays pretty close to the ground, under leaves and things, and it blends in really well with its background, as you can see. But they're worth the effort because they do something very unusual, something you might not have even thought possible. Okay, North American wood frogs live over a very broad territory or range. They're found all over the northeastern United States and all through Canada and Alaska, even inside the Arctic Circle. No other frog is able to live that far north. But wherever they live, once the weather starts to turn cold and the temperatures start to drop below freezing, as soon as the frog even touches an ice crystal or a bit of frozen ground, well, it begins to freeze. Yes, Jimmy, you look a little bit taken aback.
Wait, you mean it's still alive, but it freezes? Solid?
Well, almost. Ice forms in all the spaces outside cells, but never within a cell.
But then how does its heart beat?
It doesn't.
But how can
it do such a thing? Well, that first touch of ice apparently triggers a biological response inside the frog that first of all starts drawing water away from the center of its body. So the middle part of the frog, its internal organs, its heart, lungs, liver, these start getting drier and drier, while the water that's being pulled away is forming a puddle around the organs just underneath the skin. And then that puddle of water starts to freeze. Okay, up to now, the frog's heart is still beating, right? Slower and slower, and in those last few hours before it freezes, it distributes glucose, a blood sugar, throughout its body, its circulatory system. Sort of acts like an antifreeze.
A solution of antifreeze, like you put in your car in the winter?
Well, you tell me. In frogs, the extra glucose makes it harder for the water inside the cells to freeze. So the cells stay just slightly wet, enough so that they can survive the winter. Then, after that, the heart stops beating altogether. So, is that the same?
I don't really know, but how long does it stay that way?
Well, it could be days or even months. All winter, in fact. But, see, the heart really doesn't need to do any pumping now because the blood is frozen too.
I guess I just don't see how it isn't, clinically dead.
Well, that's the amazing thing. And how it revives is pretty amazing too. After months without a heartbeat, springtime comes around again, the earth starts to warm up, and suddenly, one day, ping, a pulse, followed by another one, then another, until maybe 10, 12 hours later, the animal is fully recovered.
And does the thawing process have some kind of trigger as well?
Well, we're not sure, actually. The peculiar thing is even though the sun is warming the frog up on the outside, its insides thaw out first, the heart and brain and everything. But somehow it all just happens that way every spring.
And after they thaw, does it affect them, like their lifespan?
Well, we really don't know a lot about how long a wood frog normally lives, probably just a few years. But there's no evidence that the freezing process affects its longevity. It does have some other impacts, though. In studies, we found that when it comes to reproduction, freezing diminishes the mating performance of males. After they've been frozen, and thawed, of course, they don't seem quite as vocal. They move slower, and they seem to have a harder time recognizing a potential mate. So, if a male frog could manage not to go through this freezing cycle, he'd probably have more success in mating.
Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
A solution of antifreeze, like you put in your car in the winter?
Well, you tell me. In frogs, the extra glucose makes it harder for the water inside the cells to freeze. So the cells stay just slightly wet, enough so that they can survive the winter. Then, after that, the heart stops beating altogether. So, is that the same?
What does the professor imply when she says this?
Well, you tell me.